we really have some heavy hitters that were kind enough to join us here in St. Louis today. We're going to start off with someone that was recently nominated by Sports Business Journal as one of their 2015 Game Changers, the Commissioner of the America East Conference, Miss Amy Huchthausen. We also are very, very lucky to have the Vice President of the NCAA, Oliver Luck. Thank you.
Thank you.
And last but certainly not least, I've known Patty for the whole time I've been in St. Louis, about 16 years now, Miss Patty Viverito with the Missouri Valley Conference. Thank you, Patty. And as a moderator, so this past year I had a chance to attend several Sports Business Journal conferences, and they have a variety of their writers moderating different panels. And in my opinion, by far the best of that group is the gentleman we have here today, writer for the Sports Business Journal, Mr. Eric Fisher. Thanks, Eric.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate it. Well, good morning. Happy to be here. It's a fascinating topic, and we'll start big picture here because, you know, I've been at the magazine for a long time and had a wide-angle look at the entire sports industry. And there's really been no segment of it that's changed more in the last 5 years in college athletics. And sweeping realignment, beginning of the college football playoff, rapid changes in media rights and the deployment of that content through digital means. So let's sort of start from a big picture sense of this, particularly as it relates to realignment. And all sorts of changes, and the Big East that I grew up with in upstate New York no longer exists. From where the dominoes started to fall 5 years ago, are you at more or less where you thought you'd be and where you want to be?
I'll start.
Okay.
I think we, in the Missouri Valley, ended up where we'd hoped we'd be. Not just where we thought we'd be, but where we'd hoped we'd be. I think what you saw in the landscape of college sports was a lot of activity, like at an iceberg level, and not nearly as much underneath. At least from our perspective, we were spared a lot of that, so we've had a lot of stability.
Mm-hmm. And Oliver, you from the national level, what's been your sense of how this is all shaken itself out?
My sense is that there was obviously a big shakeout, that there's going to be a period of relative calm, I think, for another 4, 5, 6 years. There are so many historical oddities about college athletics, and if depending on what metric you used, you could take a look at the 65 power schools, right? The Power 5 schools, and there's probably a handful that shouldn't be in there, but are because of historical reason. There's a whole bunch that have grown in the last 15, 20, 30 years. This is a very dynamic country, right? And they should be probably in that mix. So there's a lot of oddities, a lot of idiosyncrasies. There's some anomalies about this organic system, because it's grown so organically. But I think we'll have some calm for the next 4 or 5 years. But I still don't think it's very well organized, quite honestly. If you look at, the volume of our business and the money that's generated, and how efficient American business traditionally is, we have a lot of inefficiencies in our system all the way through. Big school, small school, you name it, how conferences are organized. Amy and I have talked a lot about Olympic sports and how inefficient sometimes they're operated. So I think at the end of the day, we'll see more going on, but it may not be for another 5, 10 years or so. I think there'll be an immediate period of calm.
Well, you raised an important point because a lot of those original dominoes were driven by football, and you mentioned the Olympic sports, and it seems if nothing else, where we've been left, and your point about we've sort of come to a settling period, but the division between football and major basketball and everything else, if anything else, the gap is just in those divisions have only been widened. And what is your sense then of where the Olympic sports, and particularly the women's Olympic sports, have been left as a result of all of this change?
The gap is clearly getting wider. I think that's obvious to any observer, and I'm not sure any of us really know what that means long term, but I do think it puts additional pressure on the Olympic sports. Because the vast majority are not revenue generating, men's or women's, doesn't really matter, right? They're not revenue generating from an AD's perspective, they're great. I love the Olympic sports, but they're really a cost item in your P&L sheet every year. Having said that, it's hugely important that we have this broad-based programming. I think the American public would not accept, just football and men's basketball or men's and women's basketball teams. I don't think they would accept that as sort of the sole offering for intercollegiate athletics. And keep in mind, you've seen some sports, baseball being a great example, where now the College World Series is really a big event that's turned into something big. The Frozen Four has become a big event. I think there are a number of sports that, with the proper marketing support and all of that, it could develop into if not revenue generators, at least sports that sort of cover their costs. Think about SEC baseball or ACC baseball, hockey in a lot of the northern markets. Those sports are doing relatively well.
Yeah, I think, as Oliver said, I think the time period in the last 10 to 15 years where the athletics business side of college sports has really sophisticated in some respects, but it is, I think, revealed a lot of inefficiencies. I think where we'll see the tension points with Olympic sports, with women's sports now, is that we have a much more sophisticated business model, yet it's highly inefficient. And we've got to now address some challenges and how that plays out with the women's and Olympic sports. So it's going to be really interesting to see how I think our industry reacts to those things, because the financial pressures are as great as they ever have been at all levels, from the 65 down to 351 or 2 or however many Division I schools we have now. Those aren't going to go away anytime soon, but we have to protect Olympic sports and women's sports. It's essential as part of the collegiate model that we all believe in. And so it's just going to be really interesting to see, I think, that how we respond as an industry. Do we really value these things like we say we do, and is it going to be reflected in our decision making? And I honestly don't know the answer to that. I'm hopeful that it will, but I honestly can't say that we're going to be in the same situation with the number of volleyball, soccer, field hockey schools sponsoring those sports in 5 to 7 years as we are today. And that's a concern.
You wanted to jump in?
Yeah, the media concentrates on the top 65, the power conferences. For most of us in college sports, the schools that I represent, we don't view this as a cash positive enterprise. We're investing in these sports. And so, the financial pressures are huge, but our institutions have committed to what we've called the collegiate experience, the amateur experience. And we want to live in this environment, and we're willing to pay for it.
To that end, and the point you just brought up was exactly one that came up in our Game Changer conference in New York last week. And one of the thought lines building upon that is maybe all of this football-driven realignment that we've had, maybe it needs to take another step further, and maybe some of the divisions need to be redrawn based on some of these other sports, that maybe you participate in football in one collection and these other sports in another, and maybe separate that out a little bit. Is that even practical?
I feel really strongly about that. I think that the alignment was driven by football, no question. Those realignments make sense for football. You play 12 games, you play on Saturdays, you can hop on a charter, make a lot of money.
Thursday night ESPN.
But it makes no sense for most of the other sports that get sucked into that model. Unfortunately, for the Missouri Valley Conference, we didn't buy into that realignment. What we're doing makes sense geographically, and I would hate to lose our championship branding, our championship model, our ownership of these programs, simply because the top conferences made a mess of it.
Right. And you didn't end up with Baylor, San Diego State, and Boise all in the same conference. One of the other major things that have come out is a lot of these new media extensions that have come out as a result of some of this realignment. Pac-12 network, Big Ten network, direct-to-video, OTT, sometimes OTT in conjunction with a linear network. What do you see opportunity in the media space at large, and particularly as it relates to a direct-to-fan subscription type of offering?
I think the technology advancements have obviously been very useful and effective for fans and parents and everyone else that's wanting to watch it. I think it's been it's fantastic what the bigger conferences have been able to do, like you said, with Pac-12 and SEC, and the Big Ten Network, and how they've set those networks up in different ways with national media partners. Where I think the biggest benefit from, at least from my seat and Patty's seat for the rest of Division I, and even in Divisions 2 and 3, is the ability to produce games at low level cost and just distribute it on the internet, whether it's a .com or through eventually an over-the-top device. I mean, that's where we have the ability now to reach many more fans than we ever have before, when we were only tied to linear opportunities. So the fact that we can have an AmericaEast.TV network that just lives basically on a website, but that has increased our reach to parents and recruits across the country is fantastic. The development of ESPN3 and their technology, which is incredible. The capacity for them to deliver content through that platform is amazing, and it's hugely beneficial for conferences like us to continue to increase our brand and exposure in a world where there's just so much going on. And we already fight for space in media. This gives us an opportunity to hopefully continue to have a presence among everything else going on.
The most important development for the Missouri Valley Conference, piggybacking on what Amy said, is now that you are doing the OTT, we are no longer tied to time blocks on ESPN and availability. You can set start times that make sense on days that make sense, and if you're willing to produce it, you can get
no more Wednesday nights at 9:30.
Yeah, it's terrific. You don't have to try to figure out a time slot that is undesirable but is available or not available at all. Like, we can get all of our events. So, Missouri Valley just signed a contract with ESPN where things that aren't on linear networks, we're producing over time, like every single event on our campuses for ESPN3.
Yeah, so that's a really good point. For where we are in the America East and in the Northeast market, Boston, New York are the two major marketplaces in our footprint. When we were in the days of national or regional TV, we would have to wait for, all the major networks. But then New York alone has a gazillion regional sports networks. So we would have to wait for everything from the Rangers, the Mets, the Yankees, all of those things to be selected before we could even begin to put our basketball games into that. So we weren't able to put together a basketball schedule till sometimes late October, and we're playing games in November. So that flexibility allows us to have exposure and not make compromises from an academic standpoint, which is important to avoid missed class time.
One of the other big things we've obviously seen in the space at large is this whole macro level debate around amateurism, and we've obviously got the O'Bannon suit out there and other various challenges. How are you guys sort of sorting through all of that, the notion of amateurism as it currently exists, and sort of new thoughts around the sort of total cost of attendance, and out of that, what is your sort of current level of thinking and working sort of standpoint on that?
Well, I tell this little anecdote all the time because I just think it's interesting, but it really summarizes the challenge that the whole enterprise faces. When Miles Brand was at the NCAA as president years ago, former Indiana University president and a philosophy professor by training, when people asked Miles, what is amateurism, he would say it's a social construct. It means whatever we want it to mean. And really, that's spot on, because it is a social construct. And we are in the process of, the big we, writ large, are in the process of trying to figure out what are the new descriptions of the new characteristics of amateurism, right? We used to say room, book, board, tuition, fees, that was okay. Now we added on, $5,000 or $4,000 or $6,000 or $7,000 of cost of attendance. That's okay, you're still an amateur. We may or may not have to do an O'Bannon payment of $2,000, $3,000, $5,000, could be even higher. Who knows what the Ninth Circuit will come back. Well, that's okay too. So we constantly are redefining amateurism because it really is a social construct. It means what we want it to mean. So the short answer is I'm not sure where amateurism will be 5 or 10 years from now, right? We may, the Olympics changed that model. We all, at least the older folks in the room, remember when the college kids used to play in the Olympic basketball game, right? John Wooden would coach, and we'd play the Russians in the final, and that was a big, 1992 showed up, the dream team goes to Barcelona, and everybody forgot about amateurism in the Olympics, right? So you got the NHL players playing hockey in the Olympics, et cetera. So they have given up on amateurism. College athletics is really the only sort of adult group that is doing amateurism anymore, and as a result, we have the benefit of being able to define it. But we also have to do that in a very careful way So it's an enormous challenge, maybe the biggest sort of big picture challenge that the NCAA and all the schools and conferences are facing.
And I think there's a high level of tolerance for the progressive redefinition, as Oliver describes it. I think the deal breaker is if we get into free agency. And I think that's when we get off the boat.
Yeah.
You know,
Sure.
I just think that if there's going to be a split, if there's going to be a time when you're going to have to, pick which side you're on, it's going to be if we get into a situation with the Jenkins case, if it's free agency, basically,
Sure.
for recruits.
And within that, the sense that I've gotten is maybe some of this gets a little conflated, that there are some folks who really want to get paid, so to speak, and really have cuts of TV and licensing. But a lot of folks just want to be able to, speaking of the student athletes, just want to be able to go on a date, go for pizza or whatever. And maybe somehow that gets kind of redefined into cost of attendance, that sometimes I feel like the debate gets a little conflated on that. I don't know if that's the sense that you've gotten from sort of your individual student athletes, that a lot of them aren't necessarily like coming with pitchforks.
Well, I think there could be two lines that we wouldn't want to cross, and free agency is one, as Patty mentioned. The other one is, creating the employer-employee relationship. Because if we do that, effectively, college athletics will become poorly paid minor league sports. And the professionals are much better, right? The NFL folks are much better than the college kids. The NBA players are much better than the college kids. So I don't think anybody wants to cross either of those lines. And that's I think where our industry at some point maybe has to make a decision,
Yeah, this is not, it's unfortunate that we've got all these lawsuits right now because it, I think, hinders our ability to really do anything different right now because we're bound by all these different things. We can't talk about this, or we have to wait until a decision on this or that. But, in hindsight, it's always 20/20. But whenever we're at the point where we can actually have a dialogue about where should amateurism be, or where should college athletics be as it relates to the relationship with the student athlete today or in 5 years or 10 years, that's the conversation that needs to happen. So many more resources are on the picture, which means in a lot of cases, a lot more benefits to student athletes that, yes, get overlooked in the media and the narrative. Do student athletes have time demands? Absolutely they do, at all levels, not just, again, at the 65 in the Power 5 conferences. At our level, they absolutely do. And a lot of times they're not getting a full scholarship. They don't have charter planes to get them back to campus so that they can attend class the next day. So those are the things that are real issues. And if we have to redefine amateurism or create a more nimble structure to respond to that, then we should do that. But like I said, it's unfortunate that we've got O'Bannon in the Jenkins case right now that, if we were to change something, what does that do from a legal standpoint? We've got to be aware of those things. But there absolutely needs to be flexibility in our system. The system has changed from 20 years ago, 40 years ago, and we should adapt and be responsive to that.
It's kind of like what I think the point I was trying to make as well, that these cases have you defined in a particular lane, and you're sort of going down a specific legal argumentative path as opposed to having that larger conversation.
Yes, I agree.
Certainly one of the stories of 2015 is what daily fantasy has done to the entire business, and certainly you've been in the news in the last few days along this notion. We were joking backstage that perhaps he should have been wearing a DraftKings sweatshirt up here on stage, but certainly we've seen the DraftKings FanDuel throw tons of money on the pro space, and now the college level's trying to sort this all out. I guess maybe for the benefit of the audience, sort of get us up to speed on sort of where the discussions have been thus far around the notion of daily fantasy.
Well, really quickly, the starting point is an NCAA bylaw that's been around for a while, which defines fantasy as sports wagering. In other words, that's illegal, that's inappropriate for our student athletes, and we have the equivalent of mandatory sentencing, right? If a student athlete is found to have engaged in sports wagering, and the daily fantasy sites are included in that, the first offense is a year's loss of eligibility. Second offense, you're done. It's 2 and out. That's harsh, right? Because that model, those penalties came from sort of the old days, if you will, when you had to run around the corner.
So just to be clear, you have a internal policy that is above and beyond how the Internet Gaming Act on a federal level is defining that. This is your own internal rules.
This is an NCAA bylaw, and that's we educate our student athletes to ignore, avoid pick your verb, that space. Having said that, our research data indicates about 20% of student athletes are engaged in fantasy sites because it's become more or less culturally acceptable, right? This generation of college kids, they don't know what a bookie looks like because they haven't had to deal with a bookie. They can go online and do almost all of their stuff. So we've got a massive problem, quite honestly, or a massive challenge. And it's a typical challenge that any organization has because technology moves very quickly and the regulatory folks sort of lag behind. And right, 3-4 months ago, or very few folks were talking about daily fantasy sites. Now it's top of mind. We just met with Patty's Missouri Valley folks this week, met with the D1 ADs this week to try to get a sense of what our position should be, not what it is. They know what it is, but what should it be? Should we modify that? Is it truly harmful for a 19-year-old college football player at Wash U? Is it really harmful for him to engage in DraftKings, to gamble, bet, whatever, wager on the NBA? Where's the integrity of the game issue? Can he affect the integrity of the game? Right. So there's questions like that as a membership group, we have to sort of figure out what people think we should be doing. But it's a difficult issue right now.
I will tell you. And
it's complicated. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
It's complicated by the fact that many of our networks, whether it's the Pac-12 or the Big Ten, are accepting.
I was just going to bring this up that you're taking ad money.
Yeah, so right, we are quickly putting on that hypocritical glove that we like to wear every now and then.
And I think it's fair to say that there's a wide range of opinions about whether this is gambling or skill and whether or not there should be a prohibition about student-athlete participation. I think there is universal agreement that loss of a year of eligibility for a $2 bet is probably out of line.
Yeah.
Well, to that end, are you concerned that there may be some sort of legal challenge, that you've got potentially penalties in place that are, contrary to what federal law is? Is there any concern along those lines, or you feel like you're on safe ground that these are sort of the private rules of entry?
I'm not sure we're worried about that. I think it's more, is that the right thing to do for 460,000 student athletes, right? To face losing a year's worth of eligibility, or losing your entire eligibility for 5 or 10 or 15 or whatever it is, dollar wager. We have plenty of NCAA policies that are much stricter than what federal or state law would provide. So I'm not sure we're on difficult ground there. It's really a matter of what's the right thing to do. That's what it boils down to. We have a spectrum of, on the one hand, and I'm not advocating this, on the one hand, we could embrace, the college world could embrace DraftKings, FanDuel, Yahoo is now in that space, and take all their sponsorship money and provide names and images and likenesses and do all that. On the other end of the spectrum, we could fight it tooth and nail, knowing it's not going to go away because, gambling may be the oldest profession in the world. So, we've got to figure out on that big spectrum, what should the proper stance of the national office be? And that really comes from the membership.
To what degree is that deliberation informed by just a resource allocation standpoint? Because, if you sort of come down on the more draconian end of that scale, then you've got an enforcement issue, and you've got obviously finite resources in terms of dollars and manpower and so forth, just to even try to figure out who's doing what.
It's interesting. One of the groups I oversee at the NCAA is the enforcement arm, and with a lot of the recent changes, think full cost of attendance, right? We don't want to become the full cost of attendance police. We don't want to have our enforcement people go on campus and talk to the financial aid officer. How did you determine this number here for the University of Cincinnati, right? We don't have the resources, and I don't think the membership wants us to do that. We've got new concussion protocols. We don't want to become the concussion protocol experts, right? To see if, Wash U didn't follow the proper protocol at the football game against Carnegie Mellon when a kid may have gotten a concussion. So there's all these new things that are popping up on our radar screen. We've got to be really careful with our resources and how active we really are. So that's also true of the FanDuel DraftKings issue, right? We've had in the past, everybody I think remembers, point shaving scandals, Toledo, Kentucky, elsewhere.
CCNY
right?
back in the day.
Back in the day, but that's a totally different model. In the old days, the worry always was a kid would get in hock to a bookie. Right. And the bookie would say, you owe me 10 grand, Viverito. Would you miss a couple of free throws and I'll waive that? Now, with FanDuel, DraftKings. Kids and hock to his credit card company.
Right.
Right. And I don't think Visa is going to try to throw a game. They may repo your car, but
they're not going to break my kneecaps.
Yeah, not going to bust your kneecaps. So, again, technology changes, society changes, and we've got to figure out, again, what the proper stance is, for the NCAA to have on this issue. Without being too paternalistic. I always worry that we get too paternalistic. We're too in loco parentis. And, we just can't do that for 460,000 young men and women.
One of the other major macro trends we've seen in the collegiate space is on the facility side, and a huge influx of new money into upgrading and modernizing facilities, and a lot of that is driven by what we've seen on the pro level and fan expectations being redefined therein. What kind of, particularly you guys at the school and conference level, what kind of pressures are you feeling to sort of keep up with the Joneses, for lack of a better phrase?
We're holding our own, keeping up with the Joneses. In the Missouri Valley Conference, I think we've invested somewhere in the neighborhood of $500 million, $500 million in the last 15 years in just athletic facilities. On the football side, in the Dakotas, they're relatively new to Division I. They're in our football league. One of them is building a new football stadium. The other two are building brand new basketball arenas. So there's lots of money being invested in athletic facilities.
Yeah, and we're seeing the same thing at our level. At our level, it's football, even though we don't sponsor it. We've got some pretty decent FCS football schools that are, University of New Hampshire is building a brand new stadium, which is much needed up there. But to capture all of this and to keep up with, what's happening in Patty's League, to be quite honest. And at the basketball level, that's where we're seeing it, primarily at football and basketball, and less so on the baseballs and softballs that we do see at some of the bigger or more well-resourced institutions. But it absolutely is a consideration, not just in terms of, the fan, experience, but from a recruiting standpoint. At the end of the day, that's a big reason why some of these facilities are quite honestly being built in certain sports, and we have to keep up. And that doesn't change whether you're at an ACC school or an American East school.
It's no different than why the building is happening on this campus with a rec center.
Right.
It's recruitment of students in general,
right.
And we face the same thing with student athletes.
Your point, the recruitment point, is well taken, and it's like the Oregon football. I mean, that's like a 5-star resort. I mean, some of these places are just completely over the top. What kind of returns have you sort of seen thus far? And where I'm going with this is one of the things we've written about over the last couple of years is the net promoter scores for college football have still been historically low because a lot of fans have been upset that they're sort of paying fairly aggressive prices in a lot of markets for metal bleachers and a comparatively substandard driveway-to-driveway kind of experience. Have you seen tangible gains as this facility investment has begun to manifest itself?
At our schools, we had one school open a new basketball arena last year, and we did see that. I mean, part of it was just the size. Their basketball arena prior to that was very small. It was even small compared to high school standards, to be quite honest. But the fact that they now have a much bigger facility, that fans can do things, engage families outside. So absolutely, we've seen increases at that school and at a couple others that are now using like a public facility, for example. It's just a different way to engage the community as opposed to just being a campus activity. And so I do think the increases on that have changed. I know one thing that our folks are wary of, and I think we see this even at the top with these development of jobs for fan experience jobs, which just blows my mind, to be quite honest, that I could go apply to be the director of fan experience at whatever SEC school, but that's another issue. But even there, we're seeing attendance issues, in part because of what we talked about before with the access on mobile devices to watch things. It's so easy to be part of an experience and watch a game, even if you're not in the stadium. And that's a trend that I think we're going to have to continue to watch as well.
We just hope that we have good enough Wi-Fi in all of our arenas and stadiums that they'll
Big issue.
watch it on the best available device while they're right there in person watching that game.
Big issue, no doubt. And you mentioned the attendance issues, and one thing that we've seen a lot in recent years is a lot of schools reaching out to a third-party group, an Aspire group, or somebody of that sort to outsource part, if not all, of their sales, and certainly a group like Learfield or whoever on the marketing and sponsorship side. Do you anticipate that continuing for the foreseeable future, or as a lot of this maturation continues, you see some of those functions get pulled back in-house?
I can speak as a former athletic director at a state school, right? And the simple problem is that many states have rules against paying commissions to state employees. So, right, you can't really motivate a sales group very well if you can't provide, some benefits in terms of going out there and
So
hustling.
there's a functional statute issue that sets some of this in motion.
Exactly, and having run a professional sports franchise, knowing how hard it is to sell tickets, right? The same rule applies. So there's a reason that Learfield, IMG, everybody else has been in that space, Aspire, in terms of the tickets, because it's very difficult at a lot of state institutions to create, sort of that environment you want to create that professional teams are able to do, to really sell and sell aggressively and reward people for selling aggressively.
Fully incentivized sales forces. And
Right, and we looked at creating a whole new separate division within our athletic department at West Virginia, where I was the athletic director, but that gets very cumbersome because of all the overlay of state law that you have to deal with.
You were never going to be able to get out from under that?
Effectively, no. Right, it's not worth the effort. It's much easier to go out and hire Learfield or IMG or, Bernie or whomever, at Aspire to go out and sell your unused inventory. And everybody has it, right? I mean,
Right,
even the big boys have it.
Yeah.
10 years ago, that wasn't on our radar screen. Today, 7 of the 10 Valley schools use an outside marketing agency. One of the things that they bring to the table is sort of their national network and to help the sales operation that we just can't do at the local level, at our institutions, or even at the conference level. And so, I think it's made sense. It's been a good business model, and it's one that I think will continue.
Along those lines, what kind of symbiosis have you seen? Because a lot of those organizations are also hiring graduates of a number of your schools in terms of entry-level jobs and getting started in this business. Have you been able to get that kind of cycle going?
Yeah, I think it's an opportunity. It's an entry-level opportunity in a business that's very aggressive. So, yeah, I think we've seen some of those opportunities.
You mentioned the College World Series before and Frozen Four, and another thing that we've written about, particularly since Rob Manfred became MLB commissioner, is him wanting to better align with your organization and really try to solve some of the structural issues that now exist between the CWS and the draft. From your standpoint, where are those efforts, and what might some of the opportunities and outcomes be in the next year or so?
I have no idea, to be honest. I know there's discussions with Major League Baseball, right? Having said that, and we want to work well with all the professional leagues so that, for those young men or women who aspire to go professional, who are able to play professionally, they'll have a nice transition. But I'm not sure where specifically those discussions have been. There's a lot of people that believe that the baseball season should be pushed back, right? Because you have so many northern schools that really have to play their first 20 games in Florida or South Carolina or wherever because you got snow on the ground, and that's an advantage for a lot of the southern schools. You sort of see that when the College World Series comes around. There's of the X number of teams that are there's usually one, maybe two max, from the north. Everybody else is from the south. Major League Baseball is not crazy about that idea, as you can imagine.
Well, yet the collision on the other side is that a lot of the short season leagues are beginning right at the very beginning of June.
Yeah.
They're drafting these kids and they want to get them going so they can get those 3 months in before their season shuts down at Labor Day.
But if you think about college baseball, it's very unusual in the sense that, for example, at West Virginia, I'll just use my old school, all of those kids who aren't eligible for the draft or too young, what do? They go play in the wooden bat leagues.
Cape Cod or whatever.
They go play for 2 or 3 months somewhere in the wooden bat leagues. We don't have any other sport where we lose our players, our student athletes. And it's a great experience to play in the wooden bat league, Cape Cod or up in Alaska or Minnesota or wherever. But that's a very unusual model that exists. So there is a little bit of tension. I'm just, quite honestly, very happy to see college baseball over the last 25, 30 years really accelerate and become what it is today, which is, I think, a much better game, much better branding, much better championship than in years past.
The one thing I'll add on the baseball piece is there is a proposal in this year's legislative cycle that would, if adopted, change the relationship that college baseball student athletes can have with agents, and that's been because of the timing with the draft and the College World Series and conference tournaments and what have you, always has created attention. And we've had, not recently, I don't think, any major high-profile student athletes have agent issues, but we have in the past 10 years for certain. And so this could, if it's adopted, alleviate some of those concerns because of the timing of the draft with the College World Series and the inevitable fact that all of these student athletes are working with agents, whether we like it or not. It's a fact of how that culture and operation is structured in the relationship between Major League Baseball and the college games. So I'm hopeful that something can come out of that. I don't know if that's the right proposal or not, but I'm glad at least to see a proposal out for discussion, because it is an issue that we have continually wrestled with, and we know is happening, but from your point earlier, it's difficult to enforce.
There's also a proposal along the same lines regarding men's basketball, and I guess women's basketball as well, but I'm not quite sure where a college
Setting
kid,
a precedent in one sport for the other.
Yeah.
yeah, where a college kid could go to one of these NBA tryouts, right, and then return to school if his grade is not where he thinks it should be in order to go. So we're trying to work, I think, a little bit more closely
Oh,
with
kid as a junior goes to Portsmouth and then doesn't work out well and decides maybe I should come back for senior year kind of thing.
Yeah, there's a number of discussions going on with how we could better, not lose a kid just because he's deciding I'm going to go to that tryout.
Yeah.
And we should kind of leave that door open a little bit, right, for him to come back.
But all of these things, and part of where I was going with this, is that on a higher level, it seems like certainly the NCAA at the macro level, and even you at the conference level, are interfacing with the pro leagues in a substantive way that perhaps has not been done before, and certainly not since your business became the modern shape that it now is.
I suppose there's dialogue, but I think there's always been some dialogue. I mean, I think maybe the realization from the professional side is that we're all sort of intertwined in this thing. We have a unique system. There's nobody else that does college athletics in the world like we do it here. And on the one hand, you're seeing like groups like the NBA put up their own D League. Right? You don't have to go to college anymore if you want to go become a professional. You can go play in Fort Wayne, Indiana for the Fort Wayne Fury. Right? You can avoid college.
But that's the dynamic that's existed in hockey and baseball forever.
It has, and it's now it exists in soccer. Right? You don't have to go to college to play in the MLS. Right. You can go to a club team, et cetera. Everybody has a minor league, but for football, which is virtually impossible.
And now college baseball, college hockey, and college soccer are all still very strong.
Yeah. But if you ask most general managers of any sport, they'll tell you they prefer to take a kid who spent 2 or 3, 4 years in college. He's matured, he or she is a little bit older, they've worked in their game, they're getting great coaching, right? In the old days, 20 years ago, kid out of high school baseball player probably went to the minor leagues. Now you get a real decision because you're playing in college for good coaches, in nice ballparks, you're on TV, you get an education. So I think it's healthy that we're having a dialogue with the pro leagues, but I think we've always had it to a certain degree.
Well, and also certain things like Billy Beane and having pushback that there are teams out there, particularly if you play certain positions like a pitcher, that you're just not necessarily going to get a look unless you start playing some college ball.
Right.
Yeah. And kids develop differently, as we all know. I mean, I always thought, as a former 5-year NFL player, I always thought, as an 18-year-old, I couldn't imagine getting drafted in baseball. And I wasn't a baseball player, but, playing in a single A, in Bluefield, Virginia, taking the bus everywhere. That's tough at that age, right? When all your friends are in college, So.
Now, if Andrew had that opportunity in baseball, you probably would have advised him to go to school?
I probably would have, if he could have gone to Stanford, and getting 4 years of Stanford baseball. I mean, that's hard to turn down.
But what if Scott Boras had come to him and said, I can get you X, Y, and Z?
That depends on what your value system is, so I'll just leave it at that.
I think we've got a handful of minutes left. Do we have questions from the audience? Back there?
Yeah, there was a comment made that there's no employee-employer relationship in college athletics. What is the NCAA doing, if anything, to provide medical care for athletes who receive disabling injuries while playing sports for their school once they're no longer with the school?
So there's a handful of disability policies. The NCAA, for example, the Rutgers football player Eric LeGrand, remember him a couple 3 years ago? Was covered all of his rehab, et cetera, through an NCAA catastrophic injury policy. Most schools and it's hard to speak for all of them, but most of at least the Power 5 schools, and this could be the case with y'all as well. Yeah. Have some sort of a policy where they'll provide free health care for a student athlete for a couple of years, right? If they come out with a bad knee or hip or whatever, they'll, I personally know some student athletes from other schools, not from where I was an AD, but they're providing some of those benefits. It's a little bit hit and miss, I think, occasionally. It's often difficult to, determine when an injury happened and who's really responsible for that. But historically, I could say, I think, and this is, I think, true of all the Division I schools, the healthcare during the 4 or 5 years of a student athlete is the best there is. I mean, you talk about, doctors making home visits to dormitories. They do all of that, and that's all, covered by the school. And that's true of not just a football or a basketball player. That's true of a rower or wrestler or whatever. The healthcare, I believe, is really pretty good. During the 4 or 5 years, and even in that sort of 2-year space after the student is finished.
Right here in the front.
I have a hypothetical. Let's say society comes together and says, you are dictator over college sports for 10 years. What's your first change that you implement?
The title of that position.
I'd at least add benign as a descriptor to that.
Only over college sports.
Yeah.
Is that
It's anyone.
okay, ladies?
I'll let Patty go first.
You're the empress now.
Well, I guess we'd have full compliance with Title IX tomorrow, right? I'd start there.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would love to see the NCAA revenue distribution model be changed, to be honest. And I know there's a working group that's just been formed to take a look at that distribution model from the NCAA. Now, I fully understand that the contract that the NCAA gets is largely based on the men's basketball championship. I'm not naive to get that. But the fact that almost, I don't know what the percentage, but it's an extremely high percentage of the distribution of that is based on your performance in the men's basketball tournament, I think has led to a lot of different issues in men's basketball, and at the expense of some other sports. So I'd love to see that change. And then I'd also honestly love to see a better relationship or a different relationship between the college football playoff and the NCAA.
Yeah.
The NCAA supports all of the schools and conferences that play in the college football playoff, from certifying their eligibility, handling eligibility waivers, all the enforcement cases, but does not get any revenue from the college football playoff. And so figuring out, in my opinion, a different way to manage that would be fair, because we're spending, as we're part of the NCAA, and because all the basketball money is being either supported at the national office or being distributed because of your basketball performance, that's paying for the USC investigation that took forever. That's paying for the Miami investigation. That could be better used to address the entire NCAA. So those are two things, I think, from a financial perspective that I would look to change.
That's a good point. I would, if I could, I'd turn the clock back to 1984 in the Supreme Court case in 84, Georgia versus NCAA, because that's where the root is for the college football playoff, right? When the NCAA lost control because of its cartel-like behavior, lost control over the television rights for the football schools. So, I realize that's impossible to do. But Amy's point is well taken. Right now, you've got the NCAA doing all this stuff, right? All the others, every sport except for Division I, college football, or I should say FBS college football, and that's unusual. It's a really different, odd business model. The money is flowing down to the schools, but not through the NCAA, not with the input of all 1,100 schools, quite honestly, not just the Division I schools.
I vote for Amy then, for that benign dictator position.
Well, on that note, I think we're out of time, but I want to thank you all for a fascinating discussion, and we're going to turn it back over to Patrick.